The Old Mill House. Katie was 21 and from Devon, the UK. She had always been very open to the supernatural and believed that there had to be some sort of life after death. The following is Katie's account of a paranormal experience she witnessed while living in a house that was once an old mill. The house we were living in was called the Old Mill. My parents and I moved there when I was 14. It was a converted mill that still had a water wheel on the side. It didn't move, it had been inactive for some time, along with all the cogs and the workings of the wheel inside. It's been various different mills in its time: a sawmill, a paper mill, a flour mill. It was converted into a house in the 1950s, but the oldest parts of the house date back to the 12th century. I never really sensed anything when we first viewed the house. I just found the history of the building fascinating, and it was a beautiful house, so I was excited to move there. It was about 6 months after we moved that a man first appeared to me in my bedroom. I remember the first time I saw him. I thought somebody had broken in. I remember screaming and yelling to my parents that there was someone in the house. But by the time they got there, he had vanished. We searched the house. Nothing. No signs of him. I was a bit freaked out for a while, and I thought maybe my mind was just playing tricks with me. But then I saw him again, about a week later, and in the exact same spot in the corner of my bedroom. I remember I was home alone and screaming, asking, "What do you want?" At this point, I still believed it was someone breaking in. I remember scrambling for my phone, ready to dial 999, but then he spoke to me and just said, "I just want to be friends. I used to live here, and I just want to visit to see what you've done with the place." So I asked him when he lived here, and that's when he said 1874. I thought he was kidding. Then I noticed his clothing, and it was very old-fashioned, very Victorian era. He wore a brown suit and held a top hat. I screamed again and ran out into the garden. Then when I went back in, he was gone. I was so freaked. I didn't tell my parents because they would think I was out of my mind and seeing things. The next time he reappeared, he told me his name was Arthur. I always found it strange that he appeared in the exact same spot in the corner of my room. I also noticed he had a lot of bruising around his neck. I asked him about it once, but he looked very sheepish and then disappeared. He didn't look that old, maybe in his 40s. At the time, I was going through a rough spell with depression. He started appearing every time my head was in a dark place, and he started encouraging these negative thoughts and feelings. This was when I realized that he wasn't just a spirit visiting somewhere he used to live. I felt he had caught onto the negative energy around me and encouraged it to make him stronger. This is when I told my parents. I think that they thought it was just voices in my head, all to do with my mental health. We sought medical help, but I felt nobody took it seriously. That's when we decided we needed to move out of the house. The thing was, as soon as I left the house, it had all stopped. He left me alone. The voices stopped. And that's when I knew I wasn't simply going mad or having some sort of an episode. When I told him we were moving, he was very angry, and he told me, "You're mine." That's when the figure of two girls appeared. Every time they appeared, he would disappear. They were about the same age I was at the time, 15, maybe 16. One of them spoke to me, and her name was Mary, and she just said that I needed to leave, to get out, and to save myself from him. And I believed her. There was even one time where Mary possessed me. I have no recollection of any of it, so I'll just tell you what my parents told me about it as they witnessed it. I was lying on my bed crying, and they were there comforting me. Apparently, my body went stiff for about 5 to 10 seconds, and then I started talking, but it wasn't my voice. I was saying, get out, get out. You need to protect yourselves from him, save yourselves. And then I had a coughing fit and came back to myself. When my parents and I eventually moved out of the house, it felt like a breath of fresh air, like a weight had been lifted off our shoulders. Luckily, the sale of my parents' business meant that we could move and buy a new house before selling the old mill. I'm very appreciative that we managed to do that because I was just at the point where I needed to get out of that house. When we moved into our new home, we got chatting to one of our neighbours, and it turned out that he was a medium. We told him all about our experience with the old house, and he offered to go down there with one of his medium friends to see if they could pick up anything. Now, we didn't tell him all the details, but what he and his friend found out was amazing. It turns out Arthur was a priest, and he lived there in the 1870s. It turned out that he had held 2 girls captive there, Mary and Elizabeth, and he accidentally killed them. He felt so guilty and ashamed of what he did that he ended up hanging himself, you guessed it, in the corner of what became my bedroom. We managed to sell the house a year ago, and we did tell the new owners that we had some spiritual activity, but we didn't tell them the full extent of it all. We didn't want to sell the house to a family who had any young girls, as we didn't want them experiencing anything similar to what I did. Luckily, it was a lovely elderly couple who bought it, and when we told them about it being slightly haunted, they thought it was rather splendid. I've now become very aware of the fact that I can sense spirits. Even in the home we live in, I sense my grandparents, who passed away a few years ago. I wouldn't say I would never again live in a haunted house, because I feel all houses have history to them, even new builds, as there will be history to the land they're built on, just as long as the spirits are friendly and wish us no harm. Story 2. Little Tom and Bella Lucia. The following is a story of Hannah, a 24-year-old HR admin at a mental health and physical health hospital in East Sussex, England. The supernatural had always interested me. I grew up watching Most Haunted and Ghost Hunters, and now I love BuzzFeed's Supernatural series. I don't think ghosts are real in the sense that you can see an apparition of someone who died, but I do believe you can communicate with other spirits who would go through a journey to be able to communicate. I also believe in being possessed and objects having spirits attached to them. When we experienced the odd imaginary friend situation and heard footsteps in the house, etc., we didn't jump to ghost until quite late on. It was one of those things where you'd watch it on a film and you'd say, why wouldn't you move out when you can hear things in the attic or running around upstairs? But we really didn't think that much of it straight away. One of my cousins who lived with us was only a child when it began. He was somewhat mischievous, but he began to say, Bella Lucia made me do it. We were like, who? Bella Lucia was someone only my cousin Tom could see and talk to. Apparently she was a girl who I think was about 5 years old. For context, when I was about 13, myself, my sister and my dad moved into a bigger house with my auntie, uncle and 2 of my cousins who were 3 and 5 at the time. It was a house that was relatively old but nothing ancient. My sister and I shared a room on the ground floor. My dad was in a room next to us. We had our own bathroom downstairs. Upstairs, my cousin had their own rooms. My auntie and uncle had their room upstairs also. My youngest cousin Tom was a mischievous kid, and there were stories where he saw people. He once asked his mum, "Who's that man in the kitchen?" And on investigating, no one was there. When we moved into the house, he would start to misbehave and would say that Bella Lucia made him do it. It was such a specifically odd name. It made us think what a 3-year-old would come up with such a name. When my sister and I started getting random bruises and hearing noises, that spooked us, but we hadn't put 2 and 2 together yet. One night I heard running upstairs, and I said to my auntie the next morning that I heard Tom run around and asked if he had a rough night. She said no, that he slept all night in his own bed. I was 100% sure I heard a little kid run about last night. They said he didn't wake them up at all, which he typically would. Bella Lucia would start talking to Tom more and more, and he would say Bella Lucia said it's time to go to play upstairs now. We started to ask Tom who Bella Lucia was, and he was saying she's just a little girl who likes to play, but we can't see her. We kinda thought he had an imaginary friend, and that it was cute. But he would do really obscure and dangerous things that weren't really like him. Like trying to throw himself down the stairs, chewing through electrical cords and hitting himself. I kept thinking I could hear people in the kitchen, but when I went to look, no one was there. A few people mentioned similar experiences in the kitchen, where they thought someone was with them, and when they turned around to look, they were all alone. Tom once told my sister that there was someone in the kitchen with her, and on looking around, only Tom was there. I think I could hear stuff from the attic when I was upstairs. We even got someone in to inspect the loft, thinking there were animals in it because it was so noisy, but again nothing was found. It was quite eerie. I asked my sister what she remembers, and she said she remembers a balloon that wasn't filled with helium. It was floating upstairs, staying in the air, then being pulled about a bit. Tom had said Bella Lucia was holding it. We started to feel more creeped out in the house and googled Bella Lucia. The name translates to beautiful light, which is often to do with angels and has an angelical meaning. We couldn't find anything too obvious other than a book called The Haunting of Bella Lucia. After we had that thought, we became terrified of Bella Lucia and who she'd ask my cousin to hurt next. It was minimal violence and not much a 3-year-old can do. We moved out a year or so after, and my cousin hasn't seen any weird contact with Bella Lucia since. He doesn't remember a thing, which is normally weird because kids tend to remember their imaginary friends. It never got to the point where we were too scared to stay there. We kind of laughed about it. But when Tom turned creepy, we all would start to freak out a bit. We were worried about him being hurt. But he seemed to have a good pact with Bella Lucia, and that would mean they'd play together and sometimes be naughty. I never thought about the fact that the next tenants might experience the same, because I assumed that whatever it was attached to my cousin. I don't think I could live in a haunted house, but I'd love to experience it for a night in a properly haunted place. I always think though, when you know what kind of ghost or experience to expect, you create the fear yourself, and every noise you hear, you assume it's a ghost. I think if I lived somewhere and it actually had a friendly spirit in there, I wouldn't mind. But at the first sign of a paranormal activity moment, I think I'd be out. Although that's easier said than done, and would make a great video. Hannah's story is another example of not really knowing or understanding what is out there. More than one family member experienced the weird events, and none more so than little Tom. Story 3. The Stains of Blood. In the year 1856, I was staying with my wife and children at a favourite watering hole. In order to attend to some affairs of my own, I determined to leave my family there for 3 or 4 days. Accordingly, on the 8th of August, I took the railway and arrived that evening an unexpected guest at the hall, a residence of a gentleman whose acquaintance I recently made, and with whom my sister was then staying. I arrived late, soon afterwards went to bed, and before long fell asleep. Awaking after 3 or 4 hours, I was not surprised to find that I could not sleep any more, for I never rest well in a strange bed. After trying therefore in vain to induce sleep, I began to arrange my plans for the next day. I had been engaged some little time in this way when I became suddenly sensitive to the fact that there was a light in the room. Turning around, I distinctly perceived a female figure, and what attracted my special attention was that the light by which I saw it emanated from itself. I watched the figure attentively. The features were not perceptible. After moving a little distance, it disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. My first thoughts were that there was some sort of trick. I immediately got out of bed, struck a light, and found my bedroom door was still locked. I then carefully examined the walls to ascertain if there was any other concealed means of entrance or exit, but none could I find. I drew the curtains and opened the shutters, but all outside was silent and dark, there being no moonlight. After examining the room in every part, I went back to bed and began thinking calmly over the whole matter. What had I seen, and why did it appear? In the morning, as soon as I was up and dressed, I told my sister what I had seen. She then informed me that the house had a reputation of being haunted, and that a murder had been committed, but not in the room in which I had slept. Later in the day, I left, after making my sister promise to do all she could to unravel the mystery. On the following Wednesday morning, I received a letter from my sister, in which she informed me that since I left she had made inquiries and had ascertained that the murder was committed in the very room in which I slept. She added that she proposed visiting us the next day, and that she would like me to write out an account of what I had seen, together with a plan of the room, and that on the plan she wished me to mark the place of the appearance and disappearance of the figure. This I immediately did, and the next day when my sister arrived, she asked me if I had complied with her request. I replied, pointing to the drawing room table, "Yes, there is the account and the plan." As she rose to examine it, I prevented her, saying, "Don't look at it until you have told me all you have to say, because you might unintentionally colour your story by what you may read in mine." She informed me that she had had the carpet taken up in the room I had occupied, and that the marks of blood from the murdered person were there, plainly visible, and on a particular part of the floor. At my request, she also then drew a plan of the room and marked upon the spots which still bore the traces of blood. The two plans, my sister's and mine, were now compared, and we verified the most remarkable fact, that the place she had marked as the beginning and ending of the traces of blood coincided exactly with the spots marked on my plan as those on which the female figure had appeared and disappeared.